Before we have a short reading from Tad and David, I wanted to introduce them, give a little bit of an overview of the CVs of these folks. Tad Friend is a longtime staff writer for The New Yorker, as many people know, one of my favorite writers for The New Yorker. And his previous memoir was Cheerful Money, Me, My Family, and the Last Days of Lost Splendor. It was chosen as one of the best books of the year by Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. His new memoir that we're going to be talking about today is In the Early Times. Isn't there something after the colon? In the Early Times, colon.
A life reframed.
I just want to make it complete. A life reframed. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Amanda Hesser, and their twins, Walker and Addison. And then we're also really lucky to have a cartoonist of great renown, David Sipress, who was born and raised in New York City. Graduated from Williams College in 1968 and went on to study Russian history at the Department of Soviet Studies at Harvard University. We're all very lucky that we fell off the path of Russian history. He left Harvard before completing his degree and pursued a career as a cartoonist. He's been a staff cartoonist for The New Yorker since 1998. He's published nearly 700 cartoons. He lectures widely on cartooning, and his autobiographical writing has appeared frequently in The New Yorker. He lives and is here today with his wife, Ginny Shubert, an attorney and activist who works on issues of health and housing. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. David, would you read a short passage of?
Sure. Is this on?
You gotta click it on. There we go. There we go. This book is called What's So Funny, and it's a cartoonist's novel.
So this is a passage describing my father's attempt when I was a young kid to explain to me this mysterious thing called Christianity, which I only vaguely understood. And it begins with a cartoon that shows a father and son in the woods looking to chop down a tree, a Christmas tree, and they come across a tree that is shaped like a menorah. And that expresses the confusion I experienced as a kid because my family celebrated both Hanukkah and Christmas. We celebrated the two holidays in separate rooms, Christmas in the living room, Hanukkah in the kitchen, so that we wouldn't get them mixed up, I guess. Or perhaps to prevent contamination. In the living room, presents were piled up under the piano until Christmas morning. Even for dedicated assimilators like my parents, the Christmas tree would have been a bridge too far. On Christmas Eve, over the presents, my mother would play Christmas carols, while I sat beside her on the piano bench and sang along, often mystified by the strange, incomprehensible lyrics, for instance, Bells on Bobtail's Ring, or Round Young Virgin, or it sounded to me like Deck the Boss with Basil Howell. 2 weeks before Christmas were the busiest of the year for my father. He would open his jewelry shop on 61st Street and Lexington Avenue at 8 a.m. and stay until the last customer finished shopping at 9 or 10 that night. The fact that the Christmas season was so busy for the store made my father's Christmas shopping for my mother a bit of a challenge. She would have been happy to shop for her presents on her own and save him the trouble. Saving him the trouble was her life's work. But to his credit, he wouldn't cross that line. So every year for an hour or so, my mother would hold down the fort at the shop while my father hurried out to get her gifts. The year I was 6, about to turn 7, I was with my mother when she arrived at the shop, ready to take over. We'd been to Bloomingdale's to see Santa, just to see him, because I wasn't allowed to sit on his lap, the reason being some version of, you don't know where it's been. It was decided that I would go along with my father while he did his shopping. It was a cold afternoon. We were heading for the shop of a Japanese dressmaker, who barely 5 feet tall herself, specialized in clothes for tiny women like my mother. My father wore an elegant camel hair coat and a cashmere scarf. I wore a miniature replica of the same coat, wool mittens attached to the sleeves with metal clips, and a peaked wool cap with ear flaps covered by earmuffs, my mother insisted. My father was hatless as usual, oversized ears turning bright red after a few seconds in the cold, his thick gray mustache frosty and stiff. The excursion was special for me. I rarely spent time alone with my father. On Sundays, his single day off, he was so exhausted and preoccupied that I never got to really experience him. As we walked east on 61st Street and turned down First Avenue, he did the one thing that reliably resolved all questions I might have had about where I stood with him. He took my hand and held it as we walked. The dressmaker greeted us warmly in her small shop. After a brief exchange of pleasantries and some mutual commiseration about running a small business during the holidays, my father said, "I want to get something nice for Estelle." "Oh yes," the dressmaker said, making a show of giving the matter some thought before plunging into the overstuffed rack and pulling out a dress my mother had selected weeks before. My father said that it was perfect. The dressmaker wrapped it up nicely and then placed it in the brown paper bag so that my mother wouldn't know what it was. It was already dark when we stepped outside. "Mission accomplished," my father said, mainly to himself. "And I've got that jade necklace I've been saving for her all year back at the shop. Let's take a little walk," he suggested. And we turned down the next corner. In the middle of the block was a small red brick church. Behind a low wrought iron fence was a garishly floodlit nativity scene. "O come ye, all ye faithful," or something similar was playing. We stopped. The nativity scene reminded me of the dioramas I loved at the Museum of Natural History with cavemen and wild animals. My memory of the nativity scene is vivid because it was my very first. It included a life-size statue of the standard three humans, and more exciting for me, a cow, a sheep, a goat, and real straw and hay. "Why are they in a barn?" I asked my father. I took off my earmuffs so I could hear his answer. "It's all they could afford," he said. "How should I know? Let's get going. Let's get it going." "Isn't it smelly?" We had recently visited my mother's cousins in Connecticut. They had taken me to a farm where you could pet the animals, but what most impressed me was the smell. "Don't the animals go to the bathroom right there?" "Yes, no, they probably go outside. Let's hope so, at least." "That's Jesus," I said, pointing to the baby. He was chubby and pink and reminded me of the phrase "tender and mild" in Silent Night, one of those songs my mother and I sang together. The words made the baby sound like something good to eat. "What are the parents' names?" I asked. "Joseph and Mary. And those guys in the background on camels," he pointed to a painted backdrop leaning against the wall of the church. "Those are kings, supposedly." "What are kings supposedly?" "I mean, it's just a story." "Do they have countries? Why are they coming there on camels?" "They're bringing presents for the baby." "Where is Santa?" "What? The North Pole, I guess. Come on, David, let's go with this." He took my hand, but I didn't budge. "When Jesus grows up, he gets crucified," I told him. "They hammer nails in him." "What? How do you know about that?" "The movie, the one about the bathrobe." "The what?" "Last Easter, I had watched the robe on television one afternoon with my sister Linda. There's a wonderful scene in which Richard Burton, playing Marcellus, a Roman tribune, arrives at Pilate's palace along with another soldier, a centurion. As Marcellus walks in, Pilate is washing his hands. Pilate says that he has a final task for Marcellus before the tribune goes off on a new assignment. An execution, 3 criminals. One of them is a fanatic. There might be trouble. Pilate says that he had a rough night and, looking dazed and distracted, he requests a bowl to wash his hands. The slave tells him he just washed them a minute ago. "So I did," says Pilate, and he exits zombie-like. Then the centurion asks Marcellus, perhaps the most hilarious deadpan question in the history of cinema. "Your first crucifixion?" "Yes," Marcellus mumbles, staring down at the scroll containing his orders. "What?" the centurion says. "Never driven nails into a man's flesh?" "The movie where they make Jesus carry the big cross up the hill," I explained to my father, "so they can hammer the nails into his flesh and hang him up on it." "You need a robe," my father said. We were both silent for a few seconds, contemplating the pink plaster infant in his mother's arms, with a very bad death in his future. Linda, that's my sister, says Jesus was Jewish, but the Jews wanted to kill him anyway. "What was he, Daddy, Jewish or Christian?" "He was Jewish," he replied. "Christians hadn't been invented yet." "But the Jewish people wanted him dead." "We have to go, David," my father said, pulling on my arm. "But I'll tell you all about it, but now we have to mosey." "Do they kill animals to make kill the camels to make our coats?" He didn't reply to that. He started walking. Here's the deal with Jesus in a nutshell, he said. When he grew up, he started telling everyone he was the Son of God, and I looked back toward the church and pointed. Wasn't he the son of Joseph and Mary? Didn't he come from his mommy? Yes, but he kept saying otherwise. He kept saying his mommy was a virgin. How a young virgin, I thought. But she hadn't looked right. He told everybody that God sent him directly to earth to be his son and save the world, supposedly. Then what happened? He started wandering all over the place in Israel, teaching people about religion, collecting a bunch of followers who started claiming he was performing miracles. What are miracles? Tricks, like magic tricks, like walking on water. You can't do that, I said. I was already thinking that I would give it a try next summer at the beach. That's why they're miracles, but you're right. It's all a bunch of baloney. Anyway, the other Jews, the ones in charge, started hearing he was saying he was the Son of God, and they got mad. Why? He got too big for his britches. This I understood. I'd been scolded many times for the very same crime. So when he wouldn't keep his mouth shut, they complained to the Romans, who were in charge of the Jews and everyone else back then, and the rest is history. But nobody blames the Romans. Everyone blames the Jews, which is why we've had so much trouble with the Christians, even today. They hate our guts, Linda told me. Not all of them. Some do, but not all of them. For a couple of blocks, I thought about the Christians I knew, our teacher, a few friends at school, our housekeeper, our elevator man, wondering which ones hated my guts. At Lexington Avenue, we turned uptown. In front of Bloomingdale's, we passed the Salvation Army Santa. Is Santa God, I asked? Is he Jesus' father? What? No. Enough with the questions, David. Now we could see the shop a block away and my mother's head in the window. Is he Christian? Yes, he's Christian. He's based on some saint, the one in charge of presents. Speaking of which, he held up the paper bag and smiled at me. Don't tell your mother what's in here. Is that how we can get into our apartment when we don't have a chimney and all the doors are double locked? Is it a miracle, like walking on water? I don't know, ask your mother. He pulled me along and picked up the pace. Why do we have Christmas since Santa is Christian and we're Jewish and some of them hate us? Because we're Americans, he answered. His eyes were on the shop. But if they hate us, enough with the questions, David. He looked at me and gripped my hand tighter. It's just a holiday, so we can have presents. Understand? That's it. Case closed. But Hanukkah has presents. Oh, he sighed. Hanukkah's too long. Doing it all in one day makes more sense. Some of us have to work. What's a virgin, I asked as I stumbled after him across 61st Street. Someone from Virginia.
Well, I grew up in a different philosophy of the family, but actually, we kind of ended up, my mom and your dad had something in common. She, read that passage. I was thinking about, she too found me like insanely full of questions, and she wrote to my dad at one point that she found my questions incessant. One of them was, if Jesus is one of God's helpers, and Santa is one of God's helpers, and we killed Jesus, why didn't we kill Santa? Etc., 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 etc. The previous book is mostly about my mom. This one is more about my dad. So I thought I'd just begin at the beginning and go for a little up from there. Strangers often told me how wonderful my father was. Wait, my father? I think. They'd met a different man. The handsome polymath with a much-stamped passport. The earnest charmer. At conference dinners, he'd linger over the satyr to draw the seatmate's knowledge of Persian poetry. Once, with a Korean who spoke almost no English, he was able to convey baseball's arcane ball field using only pantomime. His pockets were always full of business cards, inscribed with pleas to keep in touch, as if it were a human wailing wall. Theodore Woodfriend III was Dory to his contemporaries and Day to his children, from my first tries at Daddy. We're one of those lost families where baby names stick for life. I believe from letters to the...
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
I can't hear you.
Sorry. I hope this is on.
I think it's
A tipping situation? How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. We're one of those lost families where baby names stick for life. A believer in letters to the editor and Global Report, he drove 400 miles to witness Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, won the Bancroft Prize for his history of the Philippines 3 years later, and became president of Swarthmore College in 1973 at 42. By then, he taught the histories of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, Japan, Korea, and all of Southeast Asia, as well as of American foreign relations. He possessed a resonant baritone and a self-deprecating manner, and hopes were high. The middle years, middling. Met Chad Swarthmore, who sought a spot on Reagan's National Security Council, hoping for a rise to the cabinet from there. After being passed over, he ran the Eisenhower Exchange Fellowship. EEF brought foreign go-getters to the United States to exchange ideas, and, under Day's leadership, began sending Americans overseas for the same purpose. Like America, he had a missionary temperament, and his sweeping doctrines applied even to the three of us children, the smallest of tribes. After 12 years at the EEF, he stepped down at 65 to take care of our mother, Elizabeth. But Day was a gravel truck, juddering off to mend the broken world. Mom was a coupe cornering speed. At his retirement dinner, where she wore an auburn wig after her chemo, we all had our photo taken with two of the foundation's chairmen, Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush. When the photographer pointed out that Mom's hand was obscuring Bush's thigh, Bush remarked roguishly, "Leave it, Elizabeth, it feels good where it is." "That kind of photo costs more, George," she shot back. Today's guffaw made everyone at Tiptree Ford crack up, and that photo was the keeper. One August afternoon in 2018, after lunch and before Day's nap, my younger sister Timmy, and I sat down with him in his living room to ask about his life. It felt like our last chance to understand him. He was nearly 86, and his once lush conversation was his clenched winter wheat. He clearly mistrusted our agenda. The way he sat in his blue armchair, chin low, lips tight, gray hair ballooning from his singer's head, called to mind a 19th century caricature. Boss Tweed astride his empire, the cantankerous Tories. We began gently at the beginning, which was probably a mistake, as he hated his Pittsburgh boyhood. Being raised by old school wasps was like being raised by the mini bar. Timmy asked, "How would your parents have described you?" "They would have described me as a baby, and then they would have described me as a boy." Timmy glanced over. Uh-oh. He was just checking the box. I owe my children this courtesy. I was of like mind, a paramedic filling out the forms. Did you take every possible measure? I'd expressed my expectations for so long it felt like a form of filial piety. But Timmy still hoped he might finally confess that he loved us more deeply than, for secret reasons, he could ever reveal. He closed his eyes and said, "I'm sort of hungry for ice cream." "You had some a short while ago," she said. "I did?" "Right after lunch." He frowned. Day loved sweets. In college, he got fired from a summer job filling donuts with too much jelly. When we lived in Manila in 1967, he spent 2 days in a hospital, as Mom noted in a doleful letter home. Under observation for, you won't believe it, chewing up and swallowing a Christmas tree ball. He had a rather elaborate cake in the shape of a dragon, and his eyes were glass balls. Dory thought they were candy and ate one. 2 years later, Day wrote Mom from Amsterdam to say, "Drinking young gin, tough, rather than lemon gin, a little sweet, because I want the waiter to realize I am tough. Of course, you realize, my lovely, that I am at least a little sweet. I like a lot of brown sugar in my cereal, and a lot of white sugar in my tea, and a lot of sympathy in my boyish disconsolation." He was prey to doctor desires too, but he hit those better. Timmy tried again. If somebody wrote your parents and said, "Tell us about your son. What's he like?" what would they have said? Nobody did that. His laugh was a rueful bark. Nobody cared. So no one cared about you when you were young? Well, I cared about myself. He laughed again, more softly. But no. He turned his reading lamp to glare the bulb at us. You go to the station to file a missing person report, and suddenly you're the suspect.
Thank you so much, Pat and David. Those are very funny passages, but I'd love to point out that these two books are must-reads because they're gripping and have a lot of moving material in them that just is heartbreaking, is revelatory, and they're just wonderful books all around that hit all of those high points. One question I wanted to ask both of you in turn is why now? What are the circumstances in your lives that made you want to write a memoir about family, at this point? And so maybe I'll start with David.
Well, these stories that in the book about my family have been sort of rolling around in my head my whole life. And in 2013 or so, I started writing these little personal history essays for the New Yorker website. And at some point, people started saying, you should write a book. And being a person who never wrote much more than a caption and got totally addicted to the fast-paced, creative act of doing a cartoon and writing a caption, which means you could go to work in the morning, sit down, do one, and your work was done for the day. And I couldn't imagine how I would do this with something so long-form as a book. But the stories, and I tried to write sort of fictionally for a while, and it just didn't work. But then I started remembering all these stories about my father, my mother, and my sister. And that's when I began to realize that maybe I could write this memoir. And as soon as I started and I got into it, the desire to write it became intense. And I did worry about this addiction I had to this short form kind of creativity. But what I found is that when the writing got going, it sort of happened like that, only in a series of moments, a series of insights. And on a good day when that happened, I just was happy and felt as good as I could ever feel. And so I don't know why I chose this moment to write it, but once I started, I couldn't stop. And I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks.
Well, as you noted, I had written a previous book that was about my family and my mom, and then it had to be like at least 7 or 8 years that passed from that to like let the rumblings die down in my family and like people start to talk to me again. So there was a sort of a quiet time, and then I started to, at a certain point, probably around 2016, I started to realize my father's health began to really take a downturn, and we were going to visit him and just more and taking, having somebody take care of him where the roles were suddenly reversed and it became very clear that things were going to be different and that the timeline was, shortish. And that at some point, I can't even remember when, I kind of realized that without fully recognizing it, I had essentially checked out on him and I decided I was never going to get what I wanted from him. I was going to be civil, we were going to have perfectly nice times, everything was going to be polite and friendly, but that that idea that he was going to tell me he loved me or they saw me for who I was or any of that sort of really deeper stuff that I wanted, but I sort of given up on. And I thought, well, there's only the time when it's running out. So I started to kind of like just take notes from our, and I probably honestly waited too late because his health was failing and his memory was getting not great and his temper was shorter than ever. And as you can see from the scene I read to, he was not necessarily welcoming questions, like searching questions that Timmy and I, my sister and I, were trying to get from him, some of those things in that conversation. Total fail. But I started to kind of throw notes into a kind of computer file and feel like, as a way really of just trying to tell myself my own story, and then I thought at a certain point it might be something that could be of some possible use to other people.
Great, thank you. When reading the two books, I had a feeling that all families set up elaborate mechanisms for avoiding certain topics or intimacies or pushing away emotion. And so I saw sort of, I don't know if I could categorize it as a WASP version and a Jewish version, but both families had a father who would, set up these limits about continuing the conversation. We saw a little bit about that in your reading, but it goes throughout the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, there was a rule with my father, which I always thought of as no questions, which is that any question about his distant past, his immigrant past, was off the table. It was not to be talked about. And that mystery was actually one of the things that propelled me into writing this book. I wanted to somehow see where I could go to get inside of that mystery. But more than that, as I said in it, my mother's job was to keep my father from ever getting upset when, after a hard day at the shop, he came home, all he wanted was always, quote, his peace of mind. And that meant that most topics were verboten. Anything that might upset my father, any report of how my sister had been mean to me, or anything that might upset him, my mother made sure that it never got brought up and he was never exposed to that. And they were pretty successful at that because those things just never got talked about, and I had to work all that stuff out on my own. It was both frustrating, but also, I think somehow I feel like it has something to do with my being a creative person, because I started reacting to that by drawing cartoons and thinking up little stories and somehow filling in the gaps in a way that felt good to me.
I think, likewise, we always felt as children that we'd see our father, as I described in the opening of the book, being super charming and super, warm and like almost like a kind of Donish talk show host with strangers. Like he was great at it, and you'd think, oh my God, but this person is just amazing. And Phil Donahue would come to life, but speaks Bahasa Indonesia as well. Wow. And then at home at the dinner table, it was like the life got drained out of him, and it was just super cerebral. And it was a mystery. Like, why are you good at doing that only with people you don't know, or don't know very well? And the mystery, I don't know that I've ever fully understand. I think it became clear that he had a super tough childhood emotionally. He grew up with wealth, but his parents never kissed him, never said they loved him, made him wear aluminum mittens when he was sucking his thumb, that kind of thing. Just like the nature of the time was, servants will raise you and we'll see you, when you get out of college, maybe, a little bit. So he had that, but then I discovered after he died, he kept numerous files of full of just giants, like they were sort of a kind of makeshift journal over the years, that were full of really passionate, ruminations on us and on his life and his marriage, and full of just dreams and all the stuff that was sort of the secret teeming life that I thought we should have access to as children, that for reasons of, I think, of losing control in some way or feeling like it was almost too personal for your children, he just kept to himself. And I guess part of me wonders, one of the questions I would love to ask him if he were still here would be, okay, you made me your literary executor knowing that I was going to go through this incredible wall of files that are like 40 file cabinets full of stuff, many of them tax returns and things, but lots of these very personal things. And then, so he must have known at some level that I was going to read them, but he never said, oh, by the way, you'll find the key to me after I'm dead. So, I don't know.
Thanks, Ted. Reading your memoir made me wonder what it was like to have this kind of, both memoirs have fathers who have kind of a weight of expectation for their sons, and sons who sometimes question whether they measure up. And in your book, there's actually a sense of competition, whether it's squash or erudition and producing beautiful prose. How did you feel like you were able to resolve that, or do you think that was still something that persisted?
Yes, to both. I kind of I think my dad was very competitive, and I'm competitive, and I got some of it certainly from him. And like I think he taught me to play squash. We played squash. At a certain point, I got better than him. He was a really bad sport about it. He was sort of famously judicious and fair-minded in a kind of flag-waving kind of way. Everywhere else but the squash court was like a sort of secret Bluebeard's room where he could behave really badly. And he did. And that also came out somewhat in the fact that he wanted to write poetry and fiction. That was his secret. He was a historian, but he really sort of secretly wanted to be John Updike / Philip Roth. He published a novel that got really good reviews in the 80s. It was sort of a romantic play about growing up in Pittsburgh. And then he wrote a number of other novels that didn't get published. So it was complicated. At one point when we had a really knockdown drag out about a piece I'd written about my mom after she died, it was in the New Yorker, that he'd been very complimentary about it until it got published, and his friends were like, "Ooh, that was kind of tough on Elizabeth." And then he turned and laid into me. After I very carefully, strategically made sure he read it twice beforehand to make sure I kind of, sucked the snake venom out of the wound beforehand, but that didn't work. And we had a real tough conversation, and he ended up saying, "You're my favorite living writer," which was sort of nice, but complicated. It was I did not sound too far, but I was like, "You wish I were dead," or it was like, and then the command department was like, "What about the dead? Who's ahead of me?" So it was, I don't know, we never quite got to the bottom of it, except the fact that I feel like he had also hated the book when it came out, and then he loved it until it came out, and he hated it, and then he wrote me a really lovely note years later that was, read it again, and it was a really lovely thing, and it was just a generous note. So I don't know, but yes to everything. It's just it's still unresolved, but I do feel like in understanding, even if you don't kind of work it through and have a big manly hug, I felt like I got to a point where I'm at peace with it.
David, your dad continued to harp on the fact that you never got your degree, your doctorate in Russian history, and always wondered if you might just, quit this cartooning thing for which you have, thousands of fans and adoration, and you're working at a very high level, and yet there's a sense that it wasn't complete for him.
Well, I mean, for my immigrant father with his 5th grade education, he had certain ambitions and plans for me, and Cartoonist was not on the list, that's for sure. And probably one of the worst days of my life was the day I had to call my father and tell him that I was dropping out of Harvard. And it was deeply disturbing, and he cursed me, and that curse stayed with me for most of my life. And gradually, I tried to get him to acknowledge that I was having some kind of success. But he also understood that I was not yet in the New Yorker. It took me 25 years to get published in the New Yorker. And then I finally did. And on the day that I got the first cartoon sold, I called my wife, and then I immediately called my father. And even for a person who my father was, something in the New Yorker that he understood. He knew that was a good thing, and I got a little bit of praise for that. So what I didn't understand was that at the New Yorker, just because you sell a cartoon doesn't mean it's going to come out next week. And so a couple of weeks went by, and my father would call me, and he said, "I got my New Yorker, you're not in there." And then a couple of weeks later, "Are you sure you sold that cartoon?" And what was kind of sort of tragic was that I sold it in October. It didn't come out till July. And my father died on December 31st without ever having seen it. And I always felt kind of sad about that maybe that one thing, seeing it, might have pushed him over the line into acknowledging that I was doing something worthwhile. Because, and it's understandable. I mean, he coming from where he came from, the fact that I was at Harvard meant everything to him, and much more than it did to me. It was something that when his customers came into the store, oh, that's this bracelet, it's really nice. Did I tell you that my son is at Harvard? It was something he could brag to his customers about, and that was really important to him. So I felt like I lived my life always disappointing him, and it was really hard to crawl out from under that.
Well, I loved hearing the background scenes of how a cartoonist becomes a regular in the New Yorker. For many of us who love the New Yorker and read all the cartoons first and then read some of the features.
That's everyone.
I mean, that's the big show, right? That's the pinnacle of a lot of people's aspirations as journalists, photographers, and cartoonists. What is that process like of getting there? The process of approaching that desk in the lobby every time.
Well, as I said, it took me 25 years of submitting before I sold my first cartoon to the New Yorker, and the process hasn't changed that much. These days, you hand in rough drawings, 10 or 12 rough drawings every week to the cartoon editor. I think that, are you asking about the process?
Yeah, I love that.
And then you wait around to hear from the cartoon editor. Meanwhile, the cartoon editor selects 60 out of maybe 1,000 and shows them to the big man, David Remnick, on Wednesday, and David makes the final decision about which cartoons sell. And meanwhile, you're there at home just thinking, oh God, is this going to sell in this week? And eventually, if you're lucky, you get these days an email from the editor telling you that you sold one. And it's an interesting profession because there's so much rejection built in. If you think about it, 10 or 12 ideas a week, every week, month after month, year after year, that makes a pretty large pile of rejected ideas. So you have to have a pretty strong ability to withstand that kind of rejection. On the other hand, like you said, I mean, for what I do, being a single panel cartoonist, there's the New Yorker and nothing else. It is the pinnacle. It's like the only game in town these days. So I'm constantly having to pinch myself that I actually succeeded in doing this thing that I started wanting to do when I was 6 years old. That's when I first drew my first cartoons, and I used to cut them out and scotch tape them into my mother's magazine or with Stives and Steinbergs. And so there was a David Sipress when we opened the magazine. So it was my fantasy my whole life, so I'm still amazed that I actually was able to do that.
It sounds like from your book that the cartoonists had this very convivial lunch, right, or used to, back in the old building. The older cartoonists have been able to welcome you in once you, or no?
That's an interesting question. It sort of. Some did. Some were very generous. Cartoonists in general, I was in this sort of serious art world for a while, and it's so competitive, and people tend not to be particularly nice to each other. The thing about cartoonists, in spite of the extreme competitiveness of getting published, I've always very generous and helpful, and those lunches were a chance for some of the older guys to, look at your stuff and tell you what you might do better. I had my particular drawing style, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's not like most other people's drawing styles. And back in the day, when the New Yorker would have those wonderful parties, lavish events, the first one I went to was a Christmas party, and I just couldn't believe it. I was standing there thinking, here I am, oh my God, there's Philip Roth, oh look, there's Salman Rushdie. And I'm standing there, and I see a bunch of older cartoonists, some of my heroes were over by the bar, and at some point one of them extricated himself from the group, and the drink is sloshing, and he came over to me and looked at me and said, I know who you are. Wow, he knows who I am, that's amazing. And then he said, you don't belong in the New Yorker, what do you draw, a stick? And that was pretty devastating, but as with so many bad things that have ever happened to me, I turned it into a cartoon. I went to my studio that night and I drew a cartoon of a guy, a normally drawn for me person, and then a really poorly executed dog, and the man is saying to the dog, "Bad drawing." that was published a few weeks later in the magazine.
So, could you give us a little bit, a quick building as Roman of doing stories in the New Yorker that, where your prose really shines, and how, what was that process for you? And you had some diversions into screenwriting and a couple of things, but writing these books and your work in the New Yorker is just something that a lot of people really love.
I also had like David had a sense that the New Yorker was a place I would love to land eventually. And after college, I had written for various other magazines and writing for Esquire and New York Magazine and outside. And then I wrote one piece. Years ago, I'd written a piece about Gary Shandling, the comedian of this TV show, Larry Sanders Show, and he and his manager were suing each other. It was a big Hollywood lawsuit. And an editor at the New Yorker knew I knew something about it and said, "Can you go write a quick Hollywood postcard?" I said, "Of course." And kind of knocked myself out. I was supposed to be 2,000 words. I turned in like a lot more than that, and in the classic writer way. But every word deserves, to be trying. And but it still ended up running a pretty long piece in the magazine, and they offered me a contract just on the strength of that. Tina Brown, who was still the editor, believed that I knew a lot about Hollywood, when in fact I knew a lot about Gary Shandling. So she was like, "You're going to be our Hollywood guy," and I was like, "Of course." Then she left 6 weeks later, and David Remick was saddled with this Hollywood guy who he never met, and we would sort of eye each other rarely. Because I knew, but in the same way that you have to sell, every week. You have a year-long contract, and if it's over, and they don't like it, it's like, "See you later, pal." So there was definitely an anxious first year there, kind of like, showing him that I wasn't a total mistake, because he probably would have rather hired someone he wanted to hire. But then the process is, more or less, it's essentially supposed to be pitching your ideas at a story meeting on Tuesday. But none of those ideas ever get in the magazine, so I could tell. And then since this 10 years, you have anything on the week. And I don't think, it seemed to be like 3 story ideas maybe in the magazine on the Tuesday meeting, which is the biggest waste of time. So I just fly and hold David when he doesn't want to see me, and I say, "Hey, I have this idea," and that's how I do it. I would say that it's sort of similar, not quite the same kind of pacing as you draw with a stick, but like the older writers who I looked up to, an unusual thing about the New Yorker is people write into their 90s. Like Arthur Angel was still writing really great stuff in his like late 90s, a few years before he died. And he was blind, but he was still kind of doing it. And Lillian Ross wrote into the late 80s. Pat Tompkins is still occasionally writing pieces in his 90s. So, and you get to the magazine, and I was a new staff writer, and like kind of like all excited, yay, and got introduced to Roger Angel like periodically every 6 or 8 months. "Do you know Tad Friend?" And he would look at me and like, "I don't believe I do." And, this happened, and this happened like 8 times. And each time I'd be like, "Oh yes," and he'd be like, No, I didn't. There was sort of an idea like you had to kind of prove yourself, and that a lot of people come and go, and it's not really worth recognizing you until you've been there for a while. At a certain point, he finally started a conversation with me by the elevator, and I felt like that was like my sergeant's stripes or something. I was so excited, And Lillian Ross also at a certain point when I'd been there for 4 years, said, "Oh yes, you're the new writer who just started," And I was like, "Well, it's been 4 years." She said, "No, you just began." So there was a little bit of a, you had to kind of stick around for a while before people thought you were actually going to stay.
Whenever I pass David Remnick in the hallway or something, he smiles or, seems to know who I am. So it makes my day. I wanted to ask you a question about your book is so interesting because it's about people who are still here. All your books were written when people, I could only have written about my family after they were gone. Was that something that you struggled with, deciding about that?
Yeah, I think, used to be friends with Mary Carr, who was a great writer, and I'm not writing, like my earlier book, she said, everyone's going to be mad at you no matter what. And it was very helpful, because it's sort of like you decide, it's kind of true, there's, no matter what you do, if you're going to write about people who are still alive, they're going to get, their nose out of joint, often just for reasons that are even mystifying, where you think the thing they're going to be upset about is not it, and they're just really upset that you said they had a wispy mustache or whatever it is, and people are just going to be mad at you. I guess the process has been like trying to write it, and then sort of think, oh, is so-and-so going to be, and then I let my brother and sister read the first book, and before it came out, I let my dad read it. He wanted me to take out one sentence, which was a really nice sentence. But I was fine with that, and then my brother and sister had a couple of little things and I took those out. The second book, I guess I got a tougher skin, and I was like, here's the book that is going to be published. I'd love you to read it, but I'm not kind of taking any notes. The part of the book is also ways in which describes the negative ways in which I was like my dad in my infidelities to my wife, who's here in the front row. So I let her read the book a number of times, and she really helped me kind of work through all that stuff, because that was, like super delicate and intimate and hard. And but I think kind of if you're going to do it, you have to just like close your eyes and jump in and do it, and try to be. I guess my rule was always try to be as harder on myself than on anyone else. And if I felt like I was doing that, then it kind of gave me some license. But I could always feel like, well, yeah, you were just taking hot shots.
On that note, Ted, you have some reflection in the book about writing itself and your relationship to it as that erudition and beautiful sentences is something that your dad was capable of, and I think that you are capable of, that your writing is so wonderful, and that yet some of that erudition can be a way of pushing, can be a way of possibly of being glib, or maybe of pushing away emotion, saying something lovely about a topic rather than embracing it face first.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. I'm not sure I exactly said it in the book, but I also agree with that. I think what I was going at in the book was a little bit talking about, like, I think it's easy not to write a nice sentence or even a nice paragraph. I think often where emotion actually comes through structure in my mind somehow, and this is probably not defensible as an idea, so feel free to pick it apart, but it feels to me like people who are really good with structure, which is something I think is the hardest for me and maybe for many writers, is figuring out, like, it's easy enough to write a paragraph. It's, to write a short piece, because there's no real structure. It's just like blah, 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 done, I'm out. But when you have to kind of figure out a way to create a narrative and tell something where it accumulates and something that you set up early pays off later, but not in a way that's predictable and feels surprising and inevitable, and doing that over and over again with a bunch of different strands is really hard, and I don't understand how I try to do it. I'm not sure I succeed fully, but I feel like often emotion comes because something you've known is building slowly, sort of bursts, and for the reader, hopefully, if it works. And I think that part is really hard, and I so wish there was just like one structure, one template you could just apply to everything. It'd be so easy. It's like, but it seems like every story is different and has to be told in its own way. There's like little tricks you learn of how to smuggle information in or get things across, but there's never just one structure, I don't think, and that's the hard part. You have to reinvent it every time.
And David, you talk about writing cartoons compulsively in your head, and I get the sense that it's both a wonderful gift and also sometimes a mechanism that you've developed, growing up.
Yeah, I call it my cartoon brain, which seems, in spite of efforts to keep it down, it's always popping up in almost every situation. I mean, one thing I discovered writing the book was that there was basically nothing I've ever experienced in my life that I haven't made a cartoon about at some point. Another I keep telling a short story. My wife is here too. She's also in the front row. And once we were having an argument, and it was a pretty knockdown, drag-out argument. And at one point she looked at me and she said, "David, you're not taking up a cartoon right now, are you?" No, not at all. Not at all. And then about 2 weeks later, she opened the magazine and saw a couple having an argument. And the man saying to the woman, "If it really doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong?" And so sometimes it's inappropriately active, that cartoon going on. But mostly, it's a wonderful way to go through life. And it's helped me through difficult things. If a cartoon pops into my head at really some of the worst possible moments, it's a way I have of navigating those difficult things. And so I'm very happy that I have that cartoon brain.
Is there anything else you guys want to ask each other as we came up? Or I love the TV series Ted Lasso, and in one of the series, a football player says, "Football is life." Is he wrong? Squash life?
For about 7 people in the Western Hemisphere, it's sort of hilarious to me that I've become so deeply attached to a game that no one plays or understands or cares about except for me and like 3 of my friends. So I don't think I could claim that it's life in the way that, football, soccer is a global game played by like literally billions of people. But I think having a passion that in which you're trying to you can, in the same, it's somewhat analogously to having the cartoon, and I feel like often I will learn something about how to be a better human being on a squash court. And it was, the other day it was from a guy I was taking lessons with, and he was, I was saying, he improved my backhand, and very quickly, and I said to him at the end, and I was like, I actually feel emotionally different now, before I was having to hit my backhand, now I get to hit the backhand. And he was like, "That's exactly it." He's like, that's what it is. You're playing so that you're waiting for that moment when the other guy has a weak shot and you go, "Ah!" And you're jump on it. And it sort of seemed to me in my perhaps overly joyous state at that moment that was applicable to life and the difference between having to and getting to. And I was saying this to Amanda, and then our son, who's in the corner of the room, was like, "Yeah, Steve Harvey says I get to get up in the morning." And I was like, "All right, yeah." I mean, he knows it already. He's 16, but it took me till I was 60 to figure that out.
I just have to say that this is so lame, but if you asked me the same question, I would say butternut or zucchini. So. Sorry.
But the uncomfortable truth here is that you're a Yankees fan.
That is true, and I'm very disturbed about the loss yesterday. But yeah, I'm a Yankees fan.
You grew up going to games and.
Well, we were Brooklyn Dodger fans when I grew up. Like a lot of immigrant families, there's something about the Dodgers appeal. But the Yankee fan thing started in the 90s. We were happened to be watching that fabulous team, the Derek Jeter team, and my wife developed a crush on Bernie Williams. And so she wanted to watch it for that reason, and I started watching, and then I became a Yankees fan because that team was amazing. Since then, the sort of level of character on the team has diminished somewhat, but I can't help it, I still root for them.
Well, Tad and David, thank you so much. The books are available over the table, and I believe you can get some autographs today. And
Q&A?
sure.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, they say memoir writing is creative nonfiction. And so where is the line in your work between the creative component and the nonfiction?
Well, I mean, I struggled at the beginning of writing my book with, and then at some point I just decided whether or not things actually happen the way I remember them isn't so as important as the way I remember them. That's something one learns in therapy quite a bit, actually. It's more, so I decided that it was okay to go with my unfact-checked history of my past and be inventive in places, as long as it was true to who the people were that I was writing about. And so I kind of gave up very quickly on worrying about what was fiction and what was nonfiction. Everything in it is true of the people and of me, and so that was enough nonfiction for me.
I would just, that sounds great, I would just add that, a Wikipedia entry is nonfiction to the point that it's true, and usually deeply boring, and the goal of creativity, I mean, I would like if everything that could be fact-checked in my story turned out to be, fact-checkably verifiable. I would hope that 98% of it would be. But the creativity is not making up conversations or making composite characters or whatever, but is trying to figure out a way to, as I was saying earlier, to create the story so it means something more than the information.
We have time for one more question.
I have
Go
two
ahead.
questions. One is, why did you choose the memoir genre? And second part, when you wrote memoirs, did you have any audience in mind? Who's going to read? And what kind of people will read? Or did you have some specific thing in mind?
I chose the memoir because that was what was telling me what I needed to write. The second part of your question, never for a single minute in my life as a creative person have I ever thought of who my audience is and I just do what I do. I do cartoons and I write for me. And it's been amazing to me that that seemed to connect with people. And I've never tried to think about who my audience is necessarily.
Yeah, I don't actually, I mean, I guess, yeah, I've written memoirs, but it's not like I sit down thinking like, I'm going to write a memoir, and it's going to be over there in the library. It's more just, I want to tell this story, and it could be shelved anywhere. It's just, this is the thing that it feels like I want to say, and yeah, I don't really have someone in mind and picturing them like reading it. The hardest thing I think as a writer for me anyway is it always felt easier for me to be like a musician or a painter, and probably musicians or painters would say that's totally wrong, but it felt like you could get away from what you've done, and like you can listen to the song playing back, or you can like stand back from the canvas and be like, oh yeah, that doesn't work. And I feel like it's very hard when you've written something that isn't auditory or visual, but is sort of internal and has these little funny letters that combine to make symbols that somehow pop in your brain, to get far enough away from it to see what the effect is going to have. Because very often you write something and your editor says, I don't get, like that's not working, or you don't need this, or it doesn't make sense, or you sound like an asshole, or whatever it is. I think we're trying not to, and all of it kind of leaks out somehow, and you're there on the page, but you're not there exactly the way you think you are. There's a little bit of, like where you're wearing a hospital gown, and the back of it's empty and naked, and people see what you look like. But
Well, thank you so much, Dave.